All right, welcome to Brain Health with Dr. Nissen. I am honored here to be here today with Dr. Steve Mandel and his son, Sam Mandel, who run the Ketamine Clinics of LA. We're going to be discussing ketamine, which is a treatment that some of you have heard about, probably as a treatment for depression, for treatment-resistant depression. More interestingly, as all this news is coming out about psychedelics, it's interesting to look at ketamine as another medication that could be compared against the psychedelics that are in the news right now, and to kind of see what's similar, what's different, how they all compare. So that's why I wanted to bring the Mandels here. So without further ado, Sam and Dr. Mandel, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dr. Nissen. It's really good to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, so I like to sort of dive right in before I bore people with too much about your laurels, about what you've accomplished, and rather go right for the jugular. What is it that you would want for people to take away from this conversation?
Who are you asking?
We can start with you, Dr. Mandel.
Ketamine is an amazing medicine for relieving depression and suicidality and PTSD. It works very well, like more than 70% of the time for any of those, more than that for suicidality. It works quickly. It's very safe. It's very fast. It should be available to anyone who's suffering from these afflictions.
And I would just add to that, which is so well said, that there's a tremendous amount of scientific research that proves what Dr. Mandel is saying. This is not an opinion or anecdotal, and I think that there's a lack of knowledge and understanding, and we love to talk more specifically about what ketamine is, how it works, where it's come from. And I think it's really important for people to understand these things and not be bogged down with myths or with people who don't really have the information. I mean, there's over 150 clinical trials now that have proven the efficacy of ketamine for mental health. And so it's way beyond an opinion that it works and that it helps people. And that there's some other agents that are coming out there, medicines, psychedelic medicines that are very exciting and have great potential. And there's also some important distinctions between them and ketamine, and we'd love to help people to understand that better.
Awesome. Well, so that's given us a little bit of a taste test about what's going to come, what we're going to discuss more and more. So before diving in, could you each introduce yourselves, perhaps starting with Dr. Mandel, and tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you do.
I'm Dr. Stephen Mandel. I'm a physician. I'm a board-certified anesthesiologist. I went to graduate school in clinical psychology and I completed all my coursework and all my clinical work and was writing my dissertation when I had the opportunity to go to medical school. I went to medical school and became an anesthesiologist, continued really strong interest in ketamine, or actually in mood disorders. When ketamine came out, although I was an anesthesiologist, I was blown away because ketamine was a drug I was using in anesthesia. It was first approved by the FDA in 1970 for anesthesia. And I used it for decades, literally. It was the most widely used anesthetic in the world for several decades. It's still among the most widely used anesthetics in the world today. But when it came out in the late 90s, in the 90s, that it was also relieving symptoms of PTSD, I was just blown away. How could an anesthetic do that? And I've devoted most of my life since for the last 10 years to understanding that and applying it clinically.
I'm Sam Mandel. I'm the co-founder, COO of Ketamine Clinics Los Angeles, and I am also Dr. Mandel's son. And in this context, I'm his partner and working alongside him to help bring this treatment to more people who are in need of it for 7.5 years now, and devoted all the time and energy to that cause, and it's been incredibly gratifying. I've worked in a variety of industry and have a real passion for mental health and depression, and have had a lot of friends and family who have suffered from depression, suicide, addiction, and along the way, my journey has led me to want to be more and more involved in this space to help those who are dear to me and to help those in need. And it's been really a beautiful journey as it's become more and more mainstream over the years.
Great. So, before we sort of talk about the efficacy and the safety of ketamine, perhaps we could talk a bit about what it is and how it works. So, Dr. Mandel, would you mind kind of leading us in that discussion of how exactly ketamine works and what it is?
Sure. It's a phencyclidine derivative. It was discovered in a lab in the 50s. The phencyclidines were. Ketamine was actually synthesized in 1962, and it was a more gentle and more efficacious and shorter acting and had fewer side effects than PCP. It's a kind of cousin, chemically, molecularly, of PCP. And it became an anesthetic. It works basically through the MDMA system, very different from any of the other psychoactive medicines. And it is very different molecularly from all of the other psychoactive medicines, even its cousins. It's a different chemical altogether. But it works via MDMA and AMPA and via inducing neuroplasticity by initiating a very elaborate cascade that starts with brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which actually ends up in the proliferation of dendrites and in the elaboration of more receptors. So receptor density greatly increases. We haven't actually proven this in humans. We see this absolutely incontrovertibly in laboratory models.
Great.
It really works to cause new growth in the brain.
Right. And, you're speaking about neuroplasticity, BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factors, something that some of you may have heard about. It's something that people describe as the miracle grow of the brain, helping to grow new neurons. So that's certainly an attractive sort of component about ketamine. But something that's interesting about ketamine is what Dr. Mandel was mentioning about NMDA. So that's related to glutamate, which is a totally different neurotransmitter than what you would see in most antidepressants that work on serotonin or on norepinephrine or dopamine levels at the synapse. So it's a totally different mechanism from the things that are most commonly used for depression, and that's one thing that's really interesting about ketamine.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction, as well as it's a really unique mechanism of action that is totally separate from the traditional antidepressant medications. And if I could also just add to that, in addition to the kind of neurochemical cascade that's occurring, there's the experiential component of ketamine, whether it's being received intravenously, which is really the gold standard in the way that we do it at Ketamine Clinics Los Angeles, or it's being done orally, sublingually, intramuscularly, intranasally. I mean, these are all different routes of administration that we can touch on later in more detail if you'd like. But one of the key things I wanted to add is just the experiential component, where people can have this kind of separation of mind and body in a unique way during the actual experience of the medicine that can be very therapeutic for uncovering old trauma or dealing with it, quieting the kind of default mode network in the brain, which is that kind of chatter and noise and judgment that's often really plaguing a lot of people who suffer from PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And it's a unique opportunity to do some kind of inner work for people, whether you're working with a therapist at the time and doing, CAP, or you're not. Either way, there's a lot of valuable work that can be done during the actual treatment process as well.
Yeah, so I think it'd be awesome to dive into that, because Sam just brought up a really important point, which is that, Dr. Mandel and I were talking about the neurochemical sort of impacts and the impacts directly on neurotransmitters that are occurring, but really stepping out, looking at the big picture, what's happening psychologically with the patients. And that's when, the default mode network, like you were just talking about, really comes into play, and this dissociation that can occur, sort of separation of your mind and your body, that for people that have experienced trauma, could be part of how it creates some of that healing change. So let's start with talking about, how exactly it's given, what the different options are, and specifically how the intravenous ketamine that you all are providing compares against intranasal Spravato, which many people have heard of, or S-ketamine in its sort of chemical name, and kind of how those differ.
Well, it's a really good point, because S-ketamine is the medicine in Spravato, and ketamine, the racemic mixture we use, is a 50-50 mixture of S-ketamine and R-ketamine. And the distinctions we're going to talk about is very hard to keep track of. We're talking about two different but intimately related molecules, or a mixture of two and an isolation of one of those two. And we're talking about two different routes of administration. And the differences that people make much of between the two, it's easy to confuse the differences due to route of administration with the differences due to the molecule. The molecules actually, when we're able to compare them, both being given intranasally, which is what Spravato is approved for, or S-ketamine is approved for in the United States, or given intravenously, which is what generic ketamine is approved for in the United States, and what both S-ketamine and generic ketamine are approved for in many other countries. We see that the clinical differences, although they're important, are really quite minor compared to the route of administration differences, which are enormous. Intranasal ketamine, whether we give it by S-ketamine or whether we give the generic racemic mixture, and both are legal here, the S-ketamine given intranasally is approved by the FDA for use for depression. The generic is an off-label use. In any event, intranasally, it's effective for depression and PTSD and suicidality around 40, 41, 42, maybe 44% of the time. The same chemicals given intravenously are effective in most studies around 71% of the time. And 71% is better than 44%. You can do that one in your head. In our clinic, and we do it a little differently, we have an 83% success rate. That's over 7 years, over almost 14,000 infusions, almost 4,000 patients. Meticulous records. We're getting 83% success rate. Success is measured by improvement in standard measures of depression, improving by more than 50%. That's the Beck Depression Inventory, that's the MADRS, that's the PHQ-9.
Over how long?
I don't know what you mean. How long is the duration of benefit or the extent of benefit? The extent of benefit is more than 50%, and we don't call it success. The duration is extraordinarily variable. And we would love to have the bandwidth to do some studies on that. But we see about 12 weeks effective preservation of benefit. And the standard deviation is huge. We see people needing boosters in a few weeks. We see people who don't need boosters after a year, literally.
Well, I was going to say, on the short side, a few weeks, we've had a handful of patients who've actually gone over 2 years after one initial series. And just for our listeners to just break it down so they kind of understand what we're talking about, we do a series of 6 infusions over 2 to 3 weeks. That's a pretty standard protocol of IV infusions of ketamine for mood disorders. The infusions in our clinic are about 50 to 55 minutes long, but in the research, they're 40 minutes long. And we provide a little bit more medicine over a little longer period of time, and that's one of the key distinctions as to why we feel like we're getting a notably better result. But 6 infusions over 2 to 3 weeks is a series. Then people come back for boosters, as Dr. Mandel called them, which is typically a pair of infusions done 1 or 2 days apart from one another. Patients don't return for another complete series. They have boosters, maintenance as needed. And that really varies quite widely. As he was saying, we've seen people only a few weeks. We've also seen people go over 2 years without needing any additional treatment at all. That's definitely unusual and not the norm. The norm is more around the 3-month point. But 4 months, 5 months, 6 months before needing a pair of boosters is not uncommon. And a lot of it does depend upon lifestyle optimization, which we're big advocates for. Things like adequate sleep, nutrition, fitness, talk therapy, among a list of other things that we encourage our patients to do. So those who are engaging in those activities are definitely, for the most part, getting a better and a longer lasting result.
But they get tremendous relief right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
And that you ask about the duration, and we typically getting about 12 weeks. It's interesting, the interval between boosters tends to lengthen with the booster number, not decrease. So they're not accommodating, they're not getting habituated or acclimated in any way. They're actually learning to get more mileage out of the treatments. But as Sam pointed out, they are not cures, they are treatments, and they're not standalones. All the other things that benefit your wellness, including nutrition, sleep, exercise, important, a good relationship with a peer, talking therapy, all of these things really contribute to enhancing and extending the benefit that you get from ketamine. But ketamine is the way to jumpstart real profound depression, because you can't engage in these things if you're too pooped to pop, if you're hopeless, if you feel worthless, if you're full of self-loathing, if you can't even get out of bed, if you can't concentrate, if you can't focus, if food tastes like sawdust and music sounds like noise, and a hug feels like you're being entrapped, you need to do something. And these other adjuvants will help tremendously, but you need to get out of that, and the ketamine will help you to get out of that.
Yeah, just to add one more thing. I was reading an article that was saying for depression, some tips, like one of them setting goals. And, to what Dr. Mandel's saying, it's like, if you really feel like it's a tremendous undertaking, and people who haven't experienced depression have often a hard time wrapping their head around this. But if you feel like it's a huge undertaking to brush your teeth, if it's really an agonizing amount of work to take a shower, and it's been, 2 or you're going on your 3rd day and you really need to take a shower, and it feels like an overwhelming burden, goal setting is not in the picture. And ketamine can really help to restore people's energy and motivation to start to take on those things and to take care of themselves in a way that they can expand upon and build on that progress. And we make, no confusion with patients. And whenever we talk about this, it's not a cure, it is a treatment, and it's an important part of a bigger treatment plan.
Yeah, Sam, I think that was a really good point that you brought up, because, I think in general in this field of psychiatry and mental health, I think I know a lot of people that think of, psychiatrists, anyone that gives out medications for mental illnesses, they think, oh, that's so shallow. What are you doing giving a pill? You really think that's going to make someone happy when they're, when they're thinking that their life is crap and that, and then it's not worth living anymore. But that's exactly, my point would be the exact same as yours, which is that, the point of these treatments is not to bring somebody to enlightenment, with one pill. It's rather to kind of get them going to sort of start the engine again, so that they can get back into participating into the things that really keep us well and that really, bring us to a fulfilling life, which are those lifestyle things that you mentioned, spirituality and exercise and relationship, and those things, they can only take place once you can really bring someone out of their mental illness, out of their really, depressed episode.
I'm so happy to hear you say that, because there are wonderful psychiatrists, and it seems like you're one of them as well, or will be doing more of that in your own practice, to bring that together as a whole, treating the whole person. And there are a lot of psychiatrists out there, and I wish that there were more who share that view. There's a lot out there who don't really bridge that either in their own work with the patient, or helping to guide the patient to finding or establishing a connection with another professional who can assist them in that process, which is such an important one. And I think one of the biggest missing links in efficacy of mental health treatment today.
Yeah. So just to kind of summarize for people before we go into the next part here, ketamine, it's there's 2 enantiomers of it, the S and the R, and that there is a medication that you may have heard of, which is a nasal spray, Spravato, that is just the S enantiomer of the ketamine. But what the Mandels offer in their clinic, and what I believe probably the majority of ketamine clinics offer, is the racemic mixture, where you have both the S and the R given intravenously. So it's, put into your veins. This is a treatment then that has been around for a while, like Dr. Mandel said, first of all, being used in anesthesia and now being used for depression. But nevertheless, it seems like there's been some controversy about it. And I think it'd be good for us to talk about that. Of why is there this controversy around ketamine? Why is it that, I saw the clip of you guys when you were on The Doctors, and there was sort of a debate about this. So why do you think it's being debated? And what would you say to those who think that, ketamine doesn't deserve to be an FDA-approved treatment for depression, and or that it's dangerous and not quite ready yet? What would you say about that?
I think that most of them, that's just completely factually not accurate. Ketamine is ready. Ketamine is safer than any of the other agents, including those that are prescribed. Ketamine is an off-label use. 1/3 of all psychiatric medications are prescribed off-label in the United States. 1/3. So we're in good company here. Ketamine works much faster. It has a much lower rate of, it has a much higher rate of effectiveness. Psychiatric medicines in general are effective 40 to 50% of the time, and it has a modest duration of benefit before the benefit tends to subside. Ketamine is effective at least 70% of the time. As I say, 83% in my clinic. The withdrawal from ketamine is not a withdrawal in any sense of the word of habit or addiction or habituation. It means it goes away. The withdrawal from many of the psychoactive medications, including particularly Cymbalta and some of the other Cymbalta-like drugs, is extraordinarily difficult and uncomfortable for patients. I say the most frequent psychiatric medicine that I know of, it's not exactly psychoactive, are the benzodiazepines, and withdrawal from them is hellish and extraordinarily difficult for a great many patients. And their benefit greatly diminishes very shortly, and their liabilities tend to be maintained or even increased with time.
So I would like to sort of guide this by starting with this framework, which is, that ketamine in your practice and in most places, as long as it's not given as the Spravato nasal spray, is being used off-label. So to what component do you think this contributes to the controversy, and what thoughts do you have about that?
Well, I should have mentioned, may I, Sam, just for a second? Ketamine has 3 distinct populations of use. There's the enormous population worldwide of people who use ketamine to provide anesthesia for other humans and for animals. And it's fabulous, and it works, and there's no controversy. In fact, the World Health Organization thinks it should be available to every country. Every country's pharmaceutical list, the 50 essential medicines that every country should provide to its citizens or make available to its citizens, include only 2 anesthetics. And one of them is ketamine. So that's one population. Another population is a population of abuse. And there are extensive populations of abuse of ketamine. And they range for people who are using ketamine for self-medication, the way some people use alcohol or marijuana or opiates, because they're suffering and they don't have the perspective or the resources to seek help. They are self-medicating. And then there's a population that is really using it as a means of providing themselves with oblivion. And in that population, ketamine can be pretty dangerous and pretty outrageous and produce some very nasty side effects if people persist in its use for long periods. Those side effects are not seen in people who are treated with ketamine for depression and suicidality and PTSD by physicians, by caregivers.
Right.
The dosage range in those three populations, the anesthesia population, the recreation population, and the therapeutic population, that's the third one that I didn't really describe. The dose ranges are grossly distinct and really don't overlap. So it's kind of a non-starter. If you want to demean ketamine, you point to the ketamine that the guys in the street are using it and killing for.
Mm-hmm.
The way you might with heroin, if you
I love
wanted to demean hydromorphone, which is the ketamine we use in the clinic for relief of behavioral health problems, is a whole different dosage range given by a whole different route of administration. It does not have the same liabilities.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in there as well and say, you know, ketamine is not physically addictive like opioids or alcohol or other drugs that Dr. Mandel is talking about. It's just not. People might use it, whether it's, you want to call it recreational use, or you want to call it self-medicating, or, you know, some people might be using it for one or the other or both, but it might be adulterated. They don't even know necessarily if they're doing ketamine all the time. And even if they were, it's typically snorted in amounts of 20 times what we're giving IV in the clinic. So there's, again, that key distinction of route of administration. And they're taking a lot all at once up the nose, whereas we're providing a gradual and steady infusion for 50 minutes. And it's obviously tailored to meet the needs of the patient based on their age, their weight, and other factors. So they're getting, it's a very, very different thing. As far as off-label goes, just to clarify for listeners who may not know, off-label simply means that a medicine has been found to be effective for something other than what it was originally approved for, or for a population, a demographic other than what it was originally approved for. And I think that to answer your question, Dr. Nissen, as far as the kind of stigma around this, I think it really boils down to an education gap in most cases. People just don't understand how these things work, how medicines come to market, how they come to be available to people. And they think, wow, if it's not FDA approved, then maybe the FDA disapproved it, or said it's bad or it's wrong, or there's something bad about it. Since new medicines from idea to approval take, you know, years, and on average about $1 billion before they are available on the market. A medicine like ketamine that's already approved and available, adding a new indication, which in this case would be for the treatment of, you know, depression or other mood disorders, would probably cost tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And because ketamine is a generic and nobody can recoup that investment, no one wants to spend that money. So there's no way to sell, you know, ketamine after that for these indications and gain back your investment. So that's why no one has really done it. It'd be great if some, you know, philanthropic entity would, because it would really change the country and the world. Because depression is the leading cause of disability in the United States. It's the leading cause in the world. And it's only getting worse, and it gets worse every year, as does suicide. I mean, over 44,000 people complete suicide in the US alone every single year. So these are huge, huge issues. The pharmaceutical companies, though, are out to create medicines and treatments that they can profit from and recoup their costs. So they're looking for the next thing. And ketamine is probably going to stay off label for the foreseeable future, though who knows?
So I think we've heard a lot about well, first of all, kind of how it is that ketamine is being used in an off-label matter, and how that compares against being used in an FDA-approved manner, and that doesn't necessarily equate to differences in evidence. And something else that I wanted to touch upon, as we talked about all the benefits of ketamine, is talk about the risks. You two are clearly, you know, proponents of ketamine, but you did touch upon one of the risks that, you know, that's known with ketamine is the possible abuse potential. What are some other risks, and specifically with the abuse potential, how can that be controlled in a way where people can benefit from ketamine, you know, without, you know, developing some sort of addiction or something like that?
We don't really see addiction in our population, Nick. And I think it's because of the route of administration. When you take ketamine and you put it up your nose, you get an incredible rush the delta, the rise time. It's like a rocket ship. You really get high. And if you want to keep that altitude analogy, when you give ketamine therapeutically intravenously, you gain altitude very gradually. And it's a lower maximum altitude. And most importantly, to distinguish ketamine infusions from ketamine pushed intravenously or pushed up the nose, it's sustained for a period of time. And it's during that sustained level flight, that time at altitude, that the therapeutic work goes on, that the default mode network gets quieted, that the dialogue around what happened in the trauma that's continuing to cause symptoms today gets reworked. What happened in the trauma is immutable. The narratives we tell ourselves around what happened are very plastic, and that work can take place during this rather tranquil time at altitude. When you're yo-yoing or rocket shipping, all you have time to say, oh, wow, and not time to do therapeutic work.
Right.
I also think it's important, and I think, we should touch on some of the other aspects of the question, but I just want to quickly clarify that, again, ketamine is not physically addictive. People who are using alcohol or opioids, a lot of other substances can become physically ill and become really physically dependent upon them, or they can get sick. Ketamine is not like that. It's more of a mental addiction where they are looking for an escape. And, some people misuse food in the same way. They're looking for a rush or, a sugar high, or being completely beyond satiated with the meal and the kind of high that comes with that. So it's really a more of an escape than it is an actual addiction in that respect. But, as far as clinically, what we see, we don't see any long-term side effects. Short-term side effects are a little dizziness or nausea that occurs usually. If it happens after the infusion is complete and can persist for anywhere from 10 or 20 minutes to maybe a couple of hours. Fatigue or feeling kind of tired and wanting to just rest for the remainder of the day is quite common. Obviously dissociation during the infusion, but we don't consider that a side effect. We consider that an important part of the treatment. That dissociation subsides as soon as the infusion is stopped. It begins to subside as soon as the infusion is stopped, and typically is pretty well gone 15, 20 minutes later. People are able to, get in an Uber or Lyft or have a friend or family member, which is our preference, take them home, and they're able to walk and speak, and they're not really, they might again feel a little tired, maybe a little dizzy, they've had a drink or two, but they're not really inebriated. So and we're not seeing long-term side effects. We don't see people who are craving it or looking to come in too frequently or wanting ketamine from us more than is clinically indicated. We just don't really see that.
Hmm.
We actually get referrals from a number of addiction psychiatrists who are helping people with opioids and with alcohol to use ketamine as part of a program for helping them to strengthen their resistance to cravings. Ketamine is very effective in helping patients to resist their cravings for a number of substances, including alcohol and opioids. The first use of ketamine, other than as an anesthetic that I'm aware of, was Krupitsky in Russia in the 1980s, using it for hardcore alcoholics with spectacular results.
Well, good. So we've discussed a bit about, what ketamine is, how it is, how it's being used in your clinic, how that compares against other uses of ketamine or esketamine, and we talked about how it's effective and how the sort of effectiveness you've seen, and some of the side effects and concerns that people have brought up about it, and what and how you would respond to that. I think a good thing for us to dive into next is about ketamine as a psychedelic. Would you say that it is a psychedelic or not, and why? And in light of all the discussion about psychedelics now, kind of where do you see ketamine fitting into this?
Ketamine is definitely a psychedelic. A psychedelic is not a thing. A psychedelic is something that produces a certain impact on the psyche. Ketamine definitely does that, as much or more so than any of its sisters and brothers. It's extraordinarily different from them in terms of its background and its chemistry and the way it produces its effect neurologically and neurochemically. But it is a psychedelic.
Yeah, I think if you want to break out kind of two categories of the types of psychedelics out there, there are the botanicals, right? Those are the plants like magic mushrooms. The active ingredient in those is psilocybin, ayahuasca, you know, peyote, among others. And then there are these synthetics, those things made in the lab, ketamine, MDMA, which is the active ingredient and what a lot of people know of as ecstasy.
LSD.
I'm sorry, what was that?
LSD.
LSD, exactly. Thank you. Yep. And then, of course, there are others in both category. And there's some important distinctions, you know, between the two. The majority of the interest in psychedelics that are to be used medically or for mental health today are primarily what's the only one that's legal and available now in the US, which is ketamine. And then very soon after, MDMA and psilocybin, which are, there's a lot of very exciting clinical research being done right now. And they're rapidly moving towards FDA approval and then adoption, widespread adoption for mental health. You know, there's also some interesting distinctions between the groups of people who are interested in psychedelics. We may or may not really want to talk about here today, but just for the purposes of the conversation, there's the medical, there's mental health, there's the spiritual, and those who are looking for recreation or self-medication. And there's probably a couple others too, depends on how granular you want to get.
How deep you want to go, Nick?
I'm loving all of this. It's so true because, you know, for people who listen to this and they hear us talking about LSD, they hear us talking about magic mushrooms, you know, it's for a long time, these things have been, you know, kind of piled in with the hippie movement or with street drug culture. And now it's starting to fuse with modern medicine. So I love where you're going with this, Sam.
Well, it's so easy for people to be dismissive, and I completely understand it. I don't knock them for it. I just ask that they listen and open their ears a little bit after their dismissiveness and maybe allow the possibility that there's a little more to the story. Because everybody knows somebody who, you know, ate some shrooms and freaked out and went to the hospital. I shouldn't say everybody. A lot of people know someone. A lot of people know someone who took a hit of acid and thought it was a good idea to do something stupid that might have harmed themselves or someone else, and they fortunately had a friend around or somebody who prevented them from doing it. And a lot of people know people who had life-changing, positive healing experiences and spiritual experiences and all kinds of great things too. But there's definitely a kind of connotation with psychedelics that is a lot of the stigma that we deal with around ketamine is to, it's kind of bringing it back to your earlier question as to like why it isn't more popular, what the naysayers have to say. And I think that stigma is absolutely going to be difficult to overcome with MDMA and psilocybin, which are in clinical trials now for PTSD, for depression, and seeing, you know, good results. There's some really, really important distinctions between them and ketamine. So while Dr. Mandel said, yes, ketamine is a psychedelic, it's also really in its own category in and of itself, very different from MDMA and psilocybin. And I don't know if you want to expand on that a little more, Dr. Mandel. And of course, I have things I love to say about it too, but as to how ketamine is kind of, why and how ketamine is in its own category when compared to these other psychedelic medicines.
Nick broke down very nicely early in our discussion the 4 basic neurotransmitters. It may not have been clear to the audience that of the 4, the glutamate, the dopaminergic, the norepinephrine, and the serotonergic. The glutamate is 85% of all neurotransmission. The other 3 are the other 15%. So it's glutamate that's ubiquitous in the brain. And that's, ketamine affects glutamate. The other agents we're talking about basically affect serotonin, norepinephrine, or dopamine. So they're very different. Take MDMA. I think it has great promise therapeutically. I'm an enthusiast, if you will. It's a brand new drug. It's been given to a few million people, a few tens of thousands of times. It's basically methylene dioxymethamphetamine. It's an amphetamine class of medicine. It's a derivative of amphetamine, and it has speed effects. That's why it gets people hot and gets their temperatures up and their feet dancing and their heart pounding, and they get hyperthermic and they get prostate, and afterwards they are drained, they're exhausted, they're depleted, their dopamine is gone, or their serotonin is gone. Well, hey, that's okay. And that doesn't mean it won't have great therapeutic benefits, but it's not good old glutamate. It just isn't. And these are empirical questions. These are not shoot from the hip questions. We're talking about people's lives here. We need to go slow and be cautious. And I'm not a naysayer at all. I'm really enthused about seeing these things used therapeutically. But let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Well, if I may clarify, when you say MDMA has been given millions of times, you're talking about the street use population over,
Therapeutically, hardly at all.
But therapeutically, it's been given, what, maybe hundreds or maybe thousands at this point?
Thousands.
Research, a couple thousand times. So, and same thing with psilocybin or, again, magic mushrooms used in ceremony, spirituality, recreation, lots of different uses over probably literally thousands of years in many different cultures. And yet we don't have very much data. So, you have this substance that has been around for a long time, and we have, bits and pieces of anecdotes from all over the world, but there's not any real scientific data except as of late. And so these are really important distinctions, whereas ketamine, FDA approved in 1970, we have, 50 plus years of a tremendous amount of safety and efficacy data. And even over the last 20, 25 years in its quote newer application as a mental health treatment, still 25 years, thousands and thousands of administrations, probably tens of thousands at this point with clinical research, and over many more years as far as long-term safety, efficacy, et cetera. And in our clinic, almost 14,000 infusions to almost 4,000 individuals, and we track a tremendous amount of data. We're not doing formal research, but we do have a lot of data. And we've seen that ketamine for depression, PTSD, suicidality, it works quickly, it's safe. And there's been no reports of long-term side effects when used clinically, ketamine as an anesthetic or for mental health. In other medicines, we just don't know. And they seem to have great early promise, but we do need a lot more data and a lot more time before we can really fully embrace them. And those are some really, I think really, really important distinctions. I might also just quickly add a lot of the others, or the other two that we're talking about, are very tightly integrated with psychotherapy for their therapeutic benefit. Ketamine can also be used with psychotherapy through CAP, as it's called, ketamine assisted psychotherapy, or ketamine enhanced psychotherapy, which is CAP, which is a little bit of a different structure. They're using the substance to do therapeutic work. But ketamine is also very, very powerful on its own as just a standalone treatment, not standalone from the lifestyle optimization that we recommend, or from therapy after treatment. But as far as during the actual treatment, IV infusions of just ketamine are very therapeutic for what they produce in and of themselves. And that's another important thing for people to recognize.
Mm. So it seems like you both would certainly include ketamine as a psychedelic based on the effects that it has for people. And it seems like compared against MDMA and psilocybin, as opposed to being a head-to-head comparison about the efficacy or how safe it is or how well it works, it seems like just looking at it as far as sort of congregate data, that your argument is that ketamine has more data, more years of use, and that while these other treatments are exciting, they're new, and so there's more uncertainty about both their efficacy and their safety.
Well, Nick, also the way it works with these agents, we don't really know how MDMA is going to be used, but as it's been used in the ways that we do know it, where it's been widely available, if not legal, you take it, it takes about half an hour to come on, and it lasts about 3 hours, and it leaves you pretty flat. Ketamine infusions, you start an infusion and you're where you need to be in about 10 minutes, and we turn it off and you're street ready within 20. Now, I hope that they'll be able to do that with mushrooms and with MDMA, and I hope that because I really want to see these things used to relieve these kinds of suffering. And I want it to be widely applicable and scalable. And if these drugs are going to take that long and have such a long ramp up and a long recovery time, it's going to be very hard to scale them. Intravenous ketamine is extremely scalable, and it's very safe in a way that we know when it's over, in a way that you don't know so much with mushrooms or with MDMA.
And I think, just to say, it's as far as, the listeners understanding this stuff, I think it's important because they are most likely going to become FDA approved, whereas it's very good chance that ketamine will remain in off-label use. And with that FDA approval will bring a sense of kind of increased legitimacy to them. It'll provide for hopefully insurance coverage and a number of other things that will come along with that ketamine may not have. So we're not biased in any way except for what's evidence-based and what works. And I think that it's important for people to know a little bit of this stuff and how these processes work so that they can make an informed decision about what's best for them.
That's really helpful. Well, I want to thank you both. I know this has been a long discussion. We've covered a lot of different topics. One last thing that I love to cover and love to ask people who are on the show is, aside from ketamine, aside from psychedelics, and aside from anything obvious, in the theme of brain health being the title of the podcast, what is something that you find to be helpful for your brain health that is, might be a little unexpected, or something that you're trying out recently that people may not have heard of?
Yeah, I like to go in the woods and sit and meditate, and that's not really new, I guess, but it really works for me. It's not something I can just quick rush and do in an office, but when I can get to that, or particularly when I can go to sea on a small boat, I get in touch with nature and with what's going on in my own head, and getting the two together. I guess it's not very novel, but I recommend it highly.
That's great. How about you,
Yeah,
Sam?
and mine's kind of the same, not to be boring, but I'm not onto, sometimes I think we're always looking for the newest, latest, greatest, amazing thing. And I think sometimes you guys got to take it back to the simpler times and getting out in nature and not having your cell phone in your hand all the time and disconnecting from technology and reconnecting with yourself and the world around you is incredibly powerful. It's nothing new. And I don't think it'll ever change as being one of the most powerful things that you can do for your brain health. I'm personally on a computer on my phone almost from the moment I wake up till the moment I go to sleep every single day. And I think a lot of us are, whether it's for work or for pleasure, we're always tuned into some sort of technology. And I think that's a pretty disruptive thing. And so I try to take the time when I can to disconnect from it. And I find that to be very restorative. All
right, well, there you go. A reminder from the Mandels to get outside, get some fresh air, and get in touch with nature. All right, well, sending people off here, how can they get in touch with you if they have any questions or want to learn more about what you do?
Yeah, we have a website with tons of information. It's ketamineclinics.com. It's KETAMINE, and then clinics with an S, CLINICS.com. You can call us 310-270-0625. We have really wonderful staff here, very compassionate, who are happy to speak with you. There's no obligation. And we're on social media on Instagram and Facebook, Ketamine Clinics LA, and on Twitter, Ketamine Clinics. And we're more than glad to talk to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nissen.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.